Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unit 5, Day 3. And today we're going to be talking about the Civil War itself. So when you are talking about wars as far as AP US history goes, you're not going to see test questions having to do with specific battles, unless maybe that battle is a turning point or it has something really key attached with it. They're not going to go into the specifics because they like to see the big picture. What was the cause of the war? Like, what were the effects of the war throughout the war? And then what were the effects after the war? It's still important, though, to have an understanding of the war and of the whole process of the war and the effects that it would have as you went through all of the battles. So we left off with the Battle of Manassas and the Confederate victory there at Manassas Junction in Northern Virginia. Now, after that loss there, you're going to see that President Lincoln decides to replace the Union general that had been in charge at that time. That's going to be a key theme of the war, is that Lincoln can't find a general that operates the way that he wants him to operate and can't have sustained success. So you're going to see him constantly during the war changing the major generals that are in charge of the war effort because, again, he couldn't find somebody to execute the plans that he wanted to. When he did find a really bright and good general, somebody like a George McClellan, very bright guy, very, very good at getting the army ready for battle. But then when battle finally showed up, he was a little cowardice as far as wanting to assign troops and thinking that he was constantly outnumbered and that kind of thing. Lincoln couldn't find somebody that was basically the total package as far as what he needed for generals. In the South, you're going to see that the generals stayed pretty consistent throughout the entire war, and the Southern generals, generally, historians see them as being much better tacticians, much better as far as leadership went and that kind of thing than the Northern generals had at the time. And that's why, again, you're going to see the South be very, very consistent throughout the whole war with that. Also, Southern generals are kind of credited with why the war dragged on as long as they did, because they were able to do so much with so much less men and supplies and stuff than the North was, until they got to the end of the war and completely got overwhelmed with that. So in the slides presentation, actually, when you look on slide 21, it shows the resources compared between North and South, and you'll see there was quite a big gap in resources, not of just men, but of a lot of other things between the two sides. So taking us back to the war, victory at Manassas for the Confederates. They would continue to be fighting back and forth in that. And then eventually that's going to bring us to Sharpsburg, Maryland. General Lee decides to take the war into the North for the first time. Because at this point, all of the fighting had been happening in the southern states, mostly in Virginia. So he decides to take the war into Maryland, a place called Sharpsburg. This battle would be called the Battle of Antietam, after Antietam Creek that ran through it. If you remember last class, we talked about naming convention. The Union won this battle, so their name is associated with it. So Battle of Antietam, an absolutely brutal battle, fighting back and forth all day. The Confederacy would be saved in this battle. The Army of Northern Virginia would be by Stonewall Jackson, who shows up late to the battle because he had been out fighting elsewhere. He shows up, helps solidify the cause, and really, historians call this battle a draw. But Lincoln had been looking for something. He had been looking for something good to happen finally in the war. And to him, he saw this as something good finally happening. They had fought to a draw, but he called it a victory because he said, look, we repelled them. They went back into Virginia, so that is a victory. Why had Lincoln been looking for victory? Because there were political pressures at hand. One, he had the concern about foreign entities possibly getting involved in the war. Queen Victoria over in Great Britain had actually been very interested in getting involved in the southern side of the war. And there were other factors as well for foreign countries maybe wanting to get involved in the war here in the United States. Also, Lincoln had the issue of, hey, we need to do something really to get people pumped and pushed for this cause. So he decides, as a way to keep foreign powers out and kind of reinvigorate the people here who were complaining, mostly the abolitionists, saying, hey, you're not doing anything about slavery, he would issue, after the Battle of Antietam, the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, a lot of people misunderstand the Emancipation Proclamation, but what the Emancipation Proclamation did is freed all the slaves in the southern or rebel-controlled areas of the South. It did not free all the slaves in the whole country. And there's a specific reason why Lincoln did that. Remember, you got those border states, and a lot of those border states were areas that had slaves. Some people had slaves, some didn't. But his concern was that if he freed all the slaves throughout the country, that would lead those border states to leave. So that's why he didn't do that. So it was only the rebel-controlled areas of the South he would free the slaves. Now, this had immediate ramifications because what this meant was that Great Britain, who had already outlawed slavery at the time, decides, hey, it's looking now that this war is about slavery and we don't want to be involved in that. Because remember, Lincoln from the very beginning had said that this war was not about slavery. The war was solely for keeping the Union together. At this point, you're going to see a little bit of a shift to maybe this war is more about slavery than it is about just keeping the Union together. Another key part of the Emancipation Proclamation would be that African Americans would now be allowed to fight in the armed forces here in the United States. This is something that Frederick Douglass had been pushing Lincoln to do for quite a while. He said, what group has a better reason to fight than a group of people that are fighting for their freedom, maybe even former escaped slaves who are going and fighting against their slave owners? He had been pushing for that, and Lincoln finally does that. So Battle of Antietam is going to be a real turning point as far as that, because after that, you're going to really see the South's hopes for being recognized by a foreign power are going to kind of die off after the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln himself, if you ever have a chance to see the movie Lincoln, he does a very impassioned speech about the Emancipation Proclamation and about the legality of it. Because technically it wasn't really a legal order, what he did under the Constitution, but he saw the necessity of doing that order. And also, if you think about it too, he's freeing the slaves in the rebel-controlled areas of the South. So in their minds, they're a different country. So what does an order from Abraham Lincoln have to do with them? So you're going to see that, in effect, like the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't able to free those Southern slaves because they were under a different government at the time. But still, the big factor with that is keeping those foreign powers out. Fast forward to 1863. 1863 is going to be a real pivotal year as far as the Civil War is going to go. In the eastern front of the war, well, actually in the western front of the war, you're going to see that the war had been going very, very, very poorly for the Confederates. Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was a key hub on the Mississippi River there, was under siege from the Union Army, and it would just be a matter of time before that would fall, and that would mean full control of the Mississippi River would go to the Union. Same with the Ohio River. Full control of that to the Union as well. So that's bad for the Confederacy. But despite what was happening very, very poorly in the western front of the war, you're going to see that in the eastern front of the war, here in Virginia, that things have been going really well for the Confederate Army. And the Confederate Army would actually have probably their biggest victory of the Civil War outside of Richmond at Chancellorsville. In that battle, you would actually have Stonewall Jackson, who would march his men completely around the Union Army and surprise them, and again called the greatest Confederate victory of the war there. Coming off of those victories, Lee again decides that it's time to take the war to the north. And again, this one you can say is even more so for political means, because 1864, you're going to have Lincoln running for re-election in the United States. And if the war could be taken to the north and maybe put some pressure on people in the north, they would lose support for the war and say, hey, we're sick of this. Because in the north, people already were starting to get sick of the war and saying, hey, maybe we should just surrender. In fact, George McClellan, who would run for president against Abraham Lincoln, that's what he ran on a platform of doing is let's have a peace treaty, a surrender, and we'll just coexist as two nations. So Lee takes the battle into the north, famously meets at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the little town there. Over 3 days of fighting, you're going to see the largest and bloodiest battle of the Civil War being fought at Gettysburg there, and Lee and the Confederate Army would be defeated. Earlier at the Battle of Chancellorsville that I had mentioned, Stonewall Jackson would be shot and die weeks later at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and historians believe that's one thing that definitely handicapped Lee at Gettysburg, as well as maybe his battle plan. But either way, Gettysburg is considered the major turning point of that. In fact, if you go to Gettysburg today and you go to the field where Pickett's charge was actually fought at, the Confederates actually made it across the Union lines before they were repelled and had to go back across. There is a plaque there, and it calls it the high water mark of the Confederacy, saying like this is the peak of the Confederacy, and then the rest of the war kind of went on from there. I told y'all before about my great-great-grandfather that fought in the Civil War. He actually was part of Pickett's charge and was one of the few that survived Pickett's charge and went on to fight in the rest of the war. So Gettysburg, that peak moment. You're going to see after Gettysburg, again, we still have 2 years more of fighting between the two sides. The South won a lot, the North won a lot. And really, that was the worst thing that could happen for the South, for this war to drag on, because the South, again, was outnumbered as far as men and resources, and the longer the war dragged on, the worse things got for the South. And you're going to see that in this, that throughout the war, both sides grapple with how do we add more men to the army. Both sides would eventually use a draft, which you'll read led to some rioting there in New York City. You will also see money was an issue, especially in the South. The South backed a lot of their money by cotton, and cotton prices declined major during this because foreign powers realized they could start getting war out of the or get cotton out of the Far East for a lot cheaper. And so the Southern economy was really devastated as a result of that. So fast forward, that brings us to 1865. With the war, really, Grant is in charge now. Grant, when he gets in charge, Grant, his men knew him as the Butcher because Grant kind of realized, look, we have more people, we have more resources, we should be able to destroy the Confederate army. And so you're going to see the first couple battles that he actually takes over, that the Union losses are going to be absolutely devastating. Places like Cold Harbor, Virginia, you're going to have thousands and thousands and thousands of Union soldiers die as a result of trying to push through and break through Confederate lines. Now, this plan would eventually be successful because in 1865, you're going to have Petersburg, which is south of Richmond. Petersburg was a big railroad hub for the Confederacy. Petersburg would be under siege and eventually fall. Shortly after that, you're going to have Richmond fall. Lee and retreat, trying to get back to Lynchburg to be resupplied, and then maybe catch a train with his army and go to the south and join up with one of the other Southern armies there. Grant would catch up to him right outside of Farmville, a place called Sailor's Creek. That's where you're going to have the last major battle of the Civil War fought. Sailor's Creek, absolute disaster for the South and for Lee. Lost most of his army at it. That is actually where my great-great-grandfather would be captured and taken to prison camp as a result of that. And then 2 days after Sailor's Creek, you're going to have Appomattox, Virginia, about 30 minutes down the road from here. And in Appomattox is where Lee is going to decide to surrender. So that is a very, very fast overview of the battles of the Civil War and of the events and of what exactly was happening. You're going to have more happen during that. Like I said, with Gettysburg, after that, Lincoln issues the Gettysburg Address and pretty much clarifies that, hey, this war is about keeping the Union together and slavery. You're also going to have the 13th Amendment be passed in 1865, which the 13th Amendment granted freedom to all slaves. Whereas the Emancipation Proclamation, again, had just been in the rebel-controlled areas during the war. So go through that slides presentation, make sure that you read through everything on there as far as what was happening during the war effort. Today, I have you making, you're going to make a travel brochure, pick a battle of interest to you or a campaign of interest to you from the Civil War, and make a travel brochure with that. You also have a discussion board post to do, talking about the effect of war on civilians, which during the Civil War, you're starting to see that, but today, war in general really does have a huge effect on civilians in many, many different ways. So, again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about the Civil War and love to have a discussion with you about the Civil War. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day.